They have this big story, especially Los Alamos, where there's all the physicists are up in this mesa. It's this perfect beaker of innovation, and they're all learning from each other, and it's all these big personalities. Hanford is this big engineering story in the middle of the desert that is super secret, and its job is to do its thing and have nobody notice what's going on. And it did that really well, but it's also, no one's writing exciting plays or books or movies about the triumph of the engineer.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly Lesher. Today I'm talking to Robert Franklin, Archivist and Oral Historian for the Department of Energy's Hanford Collection and Assistant Director of the Hanford History Project at Washington State University. Not only is he involved in preserving the physical collection at Hanford, but you will hear he is passionate about preserving the personal narratives from all people in the areas surrounding Hanford Lab. If you find the narratives of this episode interesting, he edited a book, Nowhere to Remember, which covers the history of the area before the Manhattan Project and the impact it had on the families after receiving evacuation orders. Robert draws on many of the oral history interviews he has conducted over the years in our conversation, and I hope you find it as interesting as I did. This means it was a really long conversation, and it was very hard for me to cut it. But this also means that we would start talking about something, and then we would go off on a tangent, and an hour later get back to it. But the conversation does flow, and so I didn't want to cut it and move it around. So it might be best to listen to both parts 1 and 2 fairly close together so you can keep track. What is Hanford's role in the Manhattan Project? Why was it built in the first place?
As your previous guest, Richard Rhodes, had mentioned, Hanford was built to produce plutonium to be fashioned into atomic weapons. It was Hanford produced the plutonium that was used in the first test of an atomic bomb, that test at the Trinity site in Alamogordo, as well as the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And Hanford was part of this effort to not put all of the Manhattan Project eggs in one basket, knowing that the separation of uranium was going to not only take a massive amount of uranium, but was going to be this long, cumbersome process. They decided to use the graphite moderated reactor design pioneered and built up by Fermi and others at a mass production scale. They also wanted to locate that far away from Oak Ridge, and they knew they needed a massive site in a pretty rural area where they could basically build, at its core, a giant factory to build this man-made element in industrial quantities.
What did the site look like before the reactor came?
Sure. So this area of southeastern, south central Washington is very arid. It is called a shrub steppe ecosystem, which means it gets a little more rain than a desert, but not enough to do, say, dry land farming, like in the Palouse region of Washington, which is a grassland region a couple hours east of here. The area was agricultural mostly, and it was very rural. The Priest Rapids Valley, which is the valley that the Hanford site pretty much took up, that valley, the plateau, up to the slopes of Rattlesnake and Saddle Mountains, and then the village of Richland, all of that had around 1,200 people, 1,250 people that lived in this approximately 680 square mile region, which is about half the size of Rhode Island. It's a very large area, but with very few people. Mostly people here were growing tree fruits, grapes, and other assorted vegetables that they would then market out to larger cities in Seattle and Portland and so on. Pasco was the cultural hub of the area, and in 1940, it had a couple thousand residents. So pretty small, overlooked area. The Hanford area had developed really in the turn of the 20th century is when first private and then federal irrigation projects were started on the Columbia River, a little bit earlier in the Yakima Valley, and then that spread down to this region. But those stories are ones of a lot of failure, honestly. A lot of people came here and tried to farm and struggled with water delivery, struggled with the heat, struggled with the remoteness. They were very small communities, the towns of Hanford and White Bluffs. that were the focal point for the people that were displaced from the Hanford site, the Euro-American settlers. And then, of course, the area, the Columbia and the Yakima and the Snake, which are the three rivers that meet in the Tri-Cities, have been inhabited for thousands of years by Native Americans. In fact, the oldest archaeological find in North America has been known as Kennewick Man, but it's approximately just over 8,000-year-old, mostly complete skeleton that was found on the banks of the Columbia River. So an area with a long history, but an area that was pretty unremarkable, and had it not been for Hanford, honestly, would still be pretty unremarkable today. I really liked how Rhodes pointed out the sacrifices that people made at home in terms of their diet. One of Hanford's main attractions, because let's face it, it's not the scenic attractions out here. Although there are people from here that really like being from here, and I think like the environment of the shrub steppe high desert. But when you're offering steak and ice cream and beer, all you can eat, that's a powerful thing for people that have been in a depression for over a decade.
It's still a powerful thing now.
Yeah.
If you opened an all-you-can-eat beer, steak, and ice cream place, I bet people would line up.
Yeah, they would. And to be able to secure those amenities during World War II, as Rhodes pointed out, it's a testament to Grove's organizational capacity and his ability to manage and secure what he needed, but also to the importance of what was being done at Hanford and the recognition that you really had to make this pliant and happy workforce who were doing things that they, you could see how a battleship contributes to the ending of a war. When you're making ammunition, you can see that. When you're building giant concrete monoliths and laying graphite to extreme tolerances, or building identical concrete cells that use vacuum piping that are interconnected in this variety of ways, you have no idea what that's doing. And you know, I'm not asking you questions, but I think a lot of it, what was being done at Hanford, was trying to keep morale up and ride that line between, like, you're helping to end the war, but that's all we're going to tell you. And you just have to trust that. And we wouldn't be paying you this well or feeding you this well if you weren't helping to end the war.
What are some of the different ways that they kept morale up amongst the workers, besides feeding them and paying them well?
Well, you know, those are really two important things. I'll talk about it in a second, but in terms of pay, Hanford was paying wages that were pretty similar to what other defense contractors were making, but even slightly higher. And for a lot of the African Americans workers that came up, and I talked to a lot of their descendants, people went from making a couple dollars a week in the South to making really, like, Vanis Daniels, his father, Vanis Sr., was a brakeman on the Southern Pacific Railroad outside of Kildare, Texas, near kind of Texarkana, right by the border there. And he supported a family of 13 on a little over $5 a week and their share crop. So they worked a plot of land, and he made $5 a week. He came up to Hanford as a labor manager, making just over $1 an hour.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, so there were high wages in other areas of the country, but DuPont and the Manhattan Project had to find what was the available labor left. And a lot of it was in the South, in places that had been overlooked, people that had little mobility. Some of the last tapped labor because they were marginal. A lot of these were marginal workers, very poor, living in very rural areas of the South, black and white.
So did Hanford go to the South and advertise for jobs and ask African Americans and poor white sharecroppers to come and work for them in Washington?
They advertised in newspapers. They had agents. A lot of it was through the pre-existing kind of railroad network. Rail still the main transportation at that time, so posting flyers in rail stations, but also newspapers. Vanis Daniels told how his father and uncle heard about it from the high school principal in Kildare. And he was telling people, like, hey, I hear there's these great jobs in Washington. You can go make a ton of money, help the war effort. And so kind of a variety of means, they sent employment agents out and targeted almost all of the states except for Tennessee. They did not pull any labor from Tennessee for obvious reasons, because they didn't want to compete. So DuPont interviewed or reached out to somewhere around a little over 200,000 people. About 120,000 of those were hired. But the Hanford construction camp, its maximum size was 45,000 people. So a lot more people were hired than actually worked on the project long term. And a lot of that was because of the conditions at Hanford and the dust, the isolation. People would say that this area is known for its wind. And when you're moving that much earth, you're going to kick up a lot of dust. And so these dust storms would come in, and they're known colloquially as termination winds. They're not quite as bad now, but people that I've talked to, I've interviewed, who were here in the 50s and 60s and 70s remember just these rolling clouds of dust. And the dust was fine. It was this fine kind of glacial silt from the Ice Age floods. It would creep in through windows. It would get in cars. People would wake up in the morning and there would be dust all over their bed. There would be dust on top of the stove. There'd be dust in the sink. There'd be dust in the cupboards. I've heard, and I don't know if this is true, but I've heard sometimes the winds would blow so hard that it would start to scrub the paint off cars because it was like sandpaper. This would have been triggering in a couple senses. One, just in terms of that's harsh environment to live in, to keep a house clean, also keep your instruments and things clean. But also, some of these folks likely had memories of the Dust Bowl. I've always wondered if that was another factor in terms of why those winds were such a powerful effect in people's lives and where they left. They were triggered them to leave. But the joke was that after a termination wind, the line at the payroll office to get their last paycheck was as long as the incoming office. And it did get so bad that DuPont started bringing in people to Pasco on the night train. So they would get to Pasco at night, and then they'd wake up in Richland, because they found when they were bringing people in the day, people were kind of looking around, looking at the dust and the heat and the no trees. If it's summer, everything's brown, not nice and green. And they were like, I'm going to keep going. I heard there's work just as good in Bremerton or in Vancouver. And so they did eventually use a little bit of trickery to get people in. And that's also the important role that all that food and that nice treatment played. The wages, the food. They also provided entertainment. They brought in some big name bands for the day. Kay Kaiser is probably the biggest one that they brought in. If you were into popular music, I know, me either. This is one of the apocryphal stories that they tell on the tour program, some of the older docents, and it's pretty much true. It'll give you an idea. So Kay Kaiser is a pretty famous piano popular guy. Again, I'm not well versed, so maybe some of your listeners might be, I can't believe they don't know who Kay Kaiser is. They need to know the classics. But anyway, pretty big. He had a nationally syndicated radio show, so he's clearly somebody.
Yeah.
He had mentioned down his show, he says, hey, I'm going to be touring for the next few days, and one of the places I'm going to is Hanford, Washington. Well, that upset the FBI. So when he got here, they met him at the train station, and they said, you should have said that. This is a top secret wartime project. You were informed it was a top secret wartime project. And what they did is to kind of mess with him, he shipped his baby grand piano with him everywhere he went, special piano. But so when he left, they held up his piano. In the chaos of war, they didn't ship it with him. They said they had problems getting it on the train. They were going to get it on a later train. He never got it back. He ended up having to replace it. That piano was later transferred to Richland High School and was the piano in their band room for like decades. It's still around somewhere in town, but this is his famous baby grand piano, and that's kind of one of these Hanford legacies. But they did. They brought in all sorts of entertainment, segregated entertainment. They had shows for black workers, shows for white workers.
The FBI would have been upset because he was announcing that Hanford not only was a place in Washington, but it was big enough so that he was actually being asked to play there. So people were going to start wondering, why is this famous musician going to this middle of nowhere town in Washington? Like, why are all these people there?
Right. It would ask the question, well, what is a Hanford? And that's exactly the question when Groves assigns Colonel Franklin Matthias to head up the Hanford site. And one of the things that Franklin Matthias does when he first gets here is he goes around to a lot of the neighboring towns and communities and kind of forms these informal deals. And I know Groves had done this in other places, basically saying, look, it'd be really great if you wouldn't report anything that's going on. This is a secret wartime project. We need to keep this secret. One of the other things they did is they stopped any litigation. So the people who own land here that the government took over, they were given evaluations by the government of their land. And some people really disagreed with these evaluations because the government was evaluated their land irrespective of irrigation improvements, just the basic land and any structures on it. Well, if you're in the arid West, all the value of your land is if it's irrigated. If you have a canal next to you, because we have great soil, we just don't get a lot of water. We have these ice age floods that dropped all this amazing glacial soil, but the government lowballed, really, in some cases lowballed appraisals, in some cases gave good appraisals, but regardless, a lot of people felt they were bad appraisals. And so they sued. And one of the other things Franklin Matthias got to do was to shelve the lawsuits for the duration of the war, saying the last thing we need too is people litigating this, because then other people start to ask, well, why'd they get their land taken away? What went in there? Why was the government so aggressive on this?
One of the reasons there were so many variations on the land estimates is that the government used several different appraisers. Some of them were more familiar with the area than others.
What are they building out there? One of the reasons they chose Hanford, one of the many, was because it was rural. And so any attention, you don't want that. The FBI interviewed, even if you were just a worker, you had a background check done on you. Especially, of course, if you were getting a clearance, if you actually knew something about what was being done here, you were heavily investigated. I've had people tell me stories of seeing their fathers getting questioned by FBI agents when they moved here. I interviewed a lady whose dad had an error on his birth certificate and got arrested for a little bit when they found it out. And they had to go to the town in Arkansas and get the priest that saw him being born signing a statement that he was actually born on that day because the birth certificate was an error. I mean, they really did their diligence. So to have Kay Kaiser blab about Hanford on a nationally syndicated radio program, yeah, you could imagine that that was a little alarming.
With the lawsuit that had to wait until the end of the war, were landowners ever able to bring that lawsuit up? And what was the result of that?
Those that could afford to go to court got much higher appraisals. One, because they had pretty sympathetic judges. One of the judges, the federal judge in Yakima, was Judge Lloyd Wheel. Lloyd Wheel grew up on the Wheel Ranch, which is on, if you're looking at a map of Hanford, the Wheel Ranch is across the Columbia. But they had this big 10,000 acre huge ranch on the other side of the Columbia in what was near the first town of White Bluffs. So this would be right in the border between Franklin and Grant County, if you're looking at a map of this area, but part of the original taking of the Hanford site. Not a site that was built on, but the ranch was taken as part of the buffer zone around the actual construction. The Wheel family had had their land taken, and it just so happened that Lloyd Wheel's a judge. And so he heard some of these cases. And you can imagine that although he was a consummate judge and still had to be impartial, but was definitely sympathetic, one of the things that he was doing when these cases went before juries is he was bringing the jury pool down to the borders of the reservation in early 43 and saying, look at what they took. You can still see some of the orchards here. And when Matthias found out that that was happening, that's when these lawsuits stopped. They were like, you got to shelve these. You can't be bringing people down here to look at what's being done and sing this woe is them story because we're trying to build this super secret wartime project. So those that could afford to take the government to court got pretty good payouts. But I've looked through one of the collections that was an amazing collection to get that I collected about 4 years ago was the records of the Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association. This was a group led by Edmund Anderson and Annette Herringford, two people that were from Hanford and White Bluffs that basically collected the history of these communities. And this was really a history that a lot of people would put behind them and would have been really easy to lose track of because all of the arriving Manhattan Project era workers, they heard those names, but they had no connection. I mean, the town of Richland in 1945, there was almost no one from Washington that lived there, right? This was a town of total outsiders. No one had family that lived in Richland. If you had grandparents or nieces and nephews, they all lived somewhere. This was a town that really started anew. You know, in the surrounding communities, Hanford and White Bluffs people, some of them bought farms in neighboring communities, but their history, their institutions had been broken up. And so the Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association started meeting in 1943 in Prosser to kind of get all the people together. And they collected records and they had people write down their life stories. They collected old photographs. One of the things they collected was the actual appraisals. So we have some of these old appraisal records. And some of them are pretty impressive for some of these bigger farms. But some of them are like 5 acres of land, a home with no electricity or running water, and an outbuilding. On that 5 acres, 2 acres of dying trees because they haven't been watered in a bit. Some of these were really small farms, like a couple acres, 10 acres, 20 acres, people like subsistence growing. And so these people had no resources to fight the government. It was either take the government to court and in a few years maybe get some more money, or take the meager thing you got because you probably owe money, you have bills, and then move on. And a lot of people took what they were offered and moved on. Interestingly, the least bitter people were actually the group of World War I veterans that had settled on the area in soldier settlements. They were actually, according to their own records, felt the most patriotic about what they were doing, which I always found a little ironic because they had already served. They'd already given their service to the country, but many of them were happy to do something, I think maybe later in life to help. It was a different era of patriotism, or maybe a different to understand,
right?
Less transactional, I guess, than maybe today.
Did these records provide an estimation, perhaps, of how many of those landowners stayed in the area, or did they move on elsewhere?
We know family by family. Most did move to somewhere encircling the area. So Kotex County to the west. Some moved to Kennewick or Pasco. Others moved to some other big farming areas up the Yakima Valley, like Grandview and Sunnyside. Most didn't have the resources to go too much farther. And many of them were upset because they had been working for years or even maybe a couple decades and had built up a farm. And really, by the early 1940s, those that had survived the Great Depression were not only getting a little bit more regular water service because the federal government was taking better control of irrigation, but also they were seeing crop prices increase with the start of the war. They were getting top dollar there are all these government contracts to buy produce. They had been encouraged for a couple of years to plant more, and then the government comes in and just says, we're taking it. Here's the appraisal. Take it or leave it. Or you not even leave it, take it, because you can't stay. You can't refuse. A lot of the folks we interviewed moved nearby Walla Walla. I interviewed one family, the Cass family. They went from a 20-acre farm in Richland to 5 acres in Kennewick. That's all they could afford. Because that was the other whammy, is that not only were these appraisals low, but because of the desire for crops, plus the population pressure that Hanford and the Pasco rail yard had put on the surrounding land, houses were rapidly increasing in value, and land in the Tri-Cities was rapidly increasing in value. So these people got lowballed and faced higher prices for farmland and homes. So it really hurt a lot of them. And Gordon Cass, who we interviewed, he just said it hurt his father and hurt their family to go from, actually, I think they had 40 acres in Richland. Had a home, a nice home, a decently modern home, electricity, no running water, but that was pretty common still in those areas at the time. And to 5 acres and like a little house, and then they couldn't even get farmland in Kennewick. They had to rent farmland somewhere else.
Oh.
It really hurt a lot of these families. They definitely settled for less.
Right. And I'm sure you can find these stories in Los Alamos and Oak Ridge. And these are the stories you don't hear about all of the people that sacrificed a lot for the war effort and didn't receive much in return.
I mean, they gave up their homes. And they can never go back to that. I mean, the land at Hanford is fundamentally altered. And even now, the buffer zone, Hanford decreased its footprint during when the tri-party agreement was signed and plutonium processing ceased, and when they determined that the buffer zone was safe. Some of it was turned into the Hanford Reach National Monument. Some of it was turned into the Pfister-Eberhardt Arid Lands Ecology Reserve, the slopes of Rattlesnake Mountain, or Laliq in the Sahaptin language, which is a sacred site to several of the tribes and native groups here. But part of it, the Wahluke Slope on kind of the north border of the site, on the Saddle Mountains, that's all grapes and apples now. I mean, you could get Wahluke Slope wine, and that was all sold. But in that time, in the early 90s, agriculture was really taking off. When that land was made publicly available, it was bought up by either farmers or other agricultural companies to grow. Chateau Ste. Michelle, which is Washington's biggest wine company, has some land there. I mean, they have land all over the place. And so that's another irony, it was several decades after. I think all those families had moved on, but even when some of that land became available, it didn't go back to those families. This was the subject of our first volume in the Hanford History series, which I was my co-author, Bob Bauman, and co-editor. We put that together with some other chapters written by a couple other folks. And Dick Wheel, the nephew of Lloyd Wheel that I was talking about earlier, who spent his summers on the Wheel Ranch, he said that the most remarkable thing about these towns was that they had this sudden and abrupt end. And in many ways, they're almost mundane. They're small rural towns in the arid West. There's very similar stories pre-1942 to towns in Idaho and Montana and Nevada and Colorado. Small farming towns where people are struggling, but it's the abrupt end of these places and what they were replaced by that really makes them unique in this Western history. And that makes it really a story worth telling on multiple angles. One, as you mentioned earlier, that these people sacrificed a lot, but two, that they're caught up in this wider narrative that's really unique. And it's so abrupt. The towns just ended. People were given around 30 days to get their stuff and move out. Some longer. There's stories of people that were providing essential services, like the family, Archie Borden. We interviewed his daughter, Kathleen Borden Finley. He ran the ice house. He ran the cold storage facility at the White Bluffs train station. He was allowed to stay because DuPont needed someone to run the ice house to keep the food and the beer cold. That's an essential service.
Essential. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, you're talking, people also might not realize this, but Hanford, this area, in July and August, we get triple digit temperatures. It's hot here. It is usually in the high 90s every day. It's hot.
Okay. So I want to say right now we're talking and you have snow.
We do.
And now you're telling me that in the summer it gets triple digits? It sounds horrible.
This is why they needed unlimited steak and beer and ice cream.
Yeah, it sounds like the worst of both worlds. At least in the Midwest, when we get really cold winters, we get mild summers.
It is not humid here. We have very low humidity. At night, the temperature, we get big, like 30, 40 degree swings, like a desert. So,
wow.
No, it's definitely, this area is not known for its climate. It's challenging, or it's not well loved for its climate, but it's challenging. Okay. Springs and falls here are really nice.
Except for the trees. No tree changing for you.
Not a lot of trees. No, down by the river, there are. I mean, in my neighborhood, there's trees, but these are all planted trees.
Recent.
Right? Yeah, we don't have big forest here. We have sagebrush and tumbleweeds. That's another thing that if you're trying to get what is this mental map of what Hanford looks like, in its natural state, it is sagebrush, and then tumbleweeds were introduced some point in the 19th century. And I mean, there are still, when you drive out to the Hanford site, and, there's this big open massive expanse between these giant concrete monoliths that are fenced in. You'll just see mountains of tumbleweeds, a couple stories tall, piled up against a fence. There are people whose job it is to go and burn the tumbleweeds or clear out the tumbleweeds. When I'm driving out to the B-Reactor or somewhere on site, wind kicks up, that classic Western scene of the tumbleweed. You might see a coyote or like an elk somewhere off in the distance. It's very Wild West. It's imagine kind of a Wild West movie, and you can kind of get what Hanford looks like, except interpose giant concrete monolith type looking buildings that are either nuclear reactors or processing facilities.
I want you to explain to me what the B-Reactor looks like from the outside. What were all of these workers building that took so many workers, but also was just slabs and slabs of concrete? Like, how big is it?
It's huge. So the B-Reactor is centered around the pile. Latticed graphite blocks covered with masonite and then cast iron. And then surrounding that is the area for the vertical safety rods and the machines that pull that. So it's about 9 stories tall, but the pile itself is about 4.5 stories tall. It's massive. When you walk in, we describe it as kind of like a cathedral, and it really is. It's a cathedral to the atomic age. It looks like when you walk into an old church with a big organ, and you got that big rectory. I mean, it is a big open space with this monolith there with the 2004 process tubes. It's really something. It kind of is a religious experience in that way that it just conveys this monumental site. It's just imposing.
But that is huge. So when I see pictures of the B-Reactor, it's just kind of this desert of nothingness and then just this building kind of plopped, and it's really hard to imagine how big it is.
It looks very interesting from the outside, but you don't, until you get inside it, you really don't get a sense for all of the engineering achievement and scale and technology that exists in the building. Because from the outside, it looks like a collection of blocks stacked on top of each other. It doesn't have any symmetry. It really looks like if you walked in a room where two toddlers were playing with blocks, and at any one moment, you would have this asymmetrical, industrial-looking building, but it doesn't look like anything else either. And so I would imagine, to kind of get back to your question, I would imagine that pretty much everybody working on it would have been asking, like, what the heck this is. It looks like a factory. Yeah, I think they knew they was making something, but as Rhodes had mentioned in your interview, when Fermi and Szilard, he's in charge of going out and trying to source all this graphite, they're getting people to line these things up in these really exact tolerances that people hadn't done before with this really high-grade graphite, and I think most people would have had some idea that they were working on something different or new. This wasn't a munitions factory. This wasn't a Jeep or an aircraft factory. It wasn't set up like an assembly line. I mean, it kind of actually is, but not in an assembly line that any of these people would have been familiar with. It was an assembly line for these fuel slugs to create plutonium. And so it's assembly like it's a factory in that sense, but it doesn't look like a factory at all.
No, because you said the building's 9 stories tall, and it's pretty much empty on the inside, right? There's no floors, there's no structure.
Yeah,
it's an
concrete.
empty building. So if you were building it, you'd think, well, what's going in here that it doesn't need any inside structure?
Right, well, and it's 9 stories tall in one part, but in some parts it's only a story tall or 2 story. You know, it really is this assemblage of blocks. The part where it's its tallest is where you have directly over the pile, where you have the hanging rods, and then you have the mechanisms that control those. And I've been up there. It's off the public tour path, but as part of our evaluation of the building, and we have some artifacts that are part of the building that are in our collection that we get to look at. I mean, I've been up there, and you're like 7 stories up. You're in this room with the machines that pull the rods up, and it's just crazy that not only do you have to walk on top of the pile to get there, but you forget you're 7 stories up because there's no windows and it's very industrial. I mean, it's steel, concrete, but it's doing this thing, though, that is not pedestrian, right? It's transmuting, it's creating an element that is not found in nature.
Why don't we talk a little bit about that? Because I feel that Hanford doesn't get the attention that Oak Ridge and Los Alamos receive.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Is it not important?
No, I would argue that it's extremely important, and I'd argue that its importance is multifold. Well, I'll try to tackle this question as best as I can.
It's a pretty involved question.
It is a
Even
pretty
though
involved
it sounds simple, it's not a simple question.
Recognition. The plutonium process turned out to be one that was the most replicatable, where it was the most reliable. And it was, although it's wildly inefficient compared to a lot of other manufacturing processes, it turned out to be more efficient than what was going on at Oak Ridge at the time with centrifuge technology and gaseous diffusion technology then. Obviously, in 2021, you would go the centrifuge gaseous diffusion route that Iran is trying to get to. You know, you would enrich. But Hanford produces the material for the Trinity test, and it's repeatable. It produces this repeatable product. But not only that, but then that is what the U.S. government doubles down on in the Cold War. We go from having 2 bombs to having, over time, 20,000 plus nuclear weapons. And 2/3 of all of those weapons have their origin point at Hanford. The stuff, the product, as it was known then, as Groves talks about, you know, they had all these names that were not descriptive. The product, when we look at the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile, comes from Hanford. That's monumental. And the other main producer is Savannah River, which pretty much just kind of copied Hanford's technology. Like Hanford pioneered the Purex process that they use to process. That's the plutonium uranium extraction process that Savannah River later used, and Hanford too. I mean, we have the Purex plant. It's one of the most contaminated buildings on site, along with the plutonium finishing plant. Go figure. That these would be areas of really high concern, and in fact make the news every so often.
They certainly do.
When things happen. Yeah, I have friends that work out there. It's a very interesting work environment that's really outside. That deserves its own podcast. But Hanford gets overshadowed. I think, one, because what went on at Hanford was not only secret during the war, but remained classified for decades after. And there is still a lot of things about Hanford that are classified, or that are official use only, or restricted data, restricted information. There's still a security apparatus at Hanford. People still have to get clearances. I'm just an archivist and historian. I had to do a background check. Even though I deal with publicly released material, I may, in the course of my job, come across controlled unclassified material. I may come across material that is a litany of different classifications. There's even a special classification of controlled unclassified nuclear material, and it's all these different government agencies have different say. All that's still there. And I think that has restricted a lot of the data about information. And really, when the beans were spilled significantly, when Groves wrote his autobiography and people really started to open up in the 1960s, what had been done at Hanford had been done at that point for almost 2 decades and had been replicated. Savannah River's up and running by that point. And it's not groundbreaking. We had commercial power plant reactors at that point. And it's like, oh, okay,
Right.
The construction of nuclear reactors, the making of fuel elements, that's normal stuff to them now. But no one had ever constructed a reactor before. No one had ever had to make fuel elements. They had a heck of a time getting the aluminum cladding to stick to the uranium billets. They had to try a lot of different ways to create this element that wouldn't rupture in the reactor, because that would be pretty bad.
Very bad, yeah.
Yeah, and it was really hard to get this aluminum cladding coating and to repeat that on the order of hundreds of thousands of times over and over and over, create that process. A lot of that information is still controlled. How you create nuclear fuel for production reactors, yeah, that's not open information. I could just talk about it generally because I can't give you any specifics because I don't know them.
Right. So Hanford sounds like it was an engineering project instead of a project for physicists.
Absolutely. Hanford is the triumph of the engineer in terms of its construction. The physicists were not in charge of building Hanford. Fermi and Szilard and others had pioneered the technology. They had proven that it would work. But it is one thing to go from Fermi's 100-watt reactor to a 250 megawatt reactor, just as it's just as difficult to go from Glenn Seaborg working with microgram quantities of plutonium to actual grams. I mean, we're talking the scale up of over 1 million times. That takes a totally different kind of expertise to take this and create an industry out of it. And DuPont was really one of, if not the only company that had the project management expertise, that understood the risk in dealing with this new entire industry. And they had a lot of the staff and engineers needed. And they took the physicists' very conceptual designs and really heavily modified them. I have 2 stories that really illustrate that well. The first is one of the best well-known stories about the B-Reactor, and that's that the initial design by Fermi and others called for about 1,500 process tubes. And that would have concentrated it more in the center of the graphite lattice. And DuPont looked at that and they said, let's fill in the edges. Because they originally designed it as kind of like a cross-looking thing, like a crosshair. DuPont said, let's fill in the edges here. We're going to put in 2004, which Fermi and others said, that's totally unnecessary. You don't need to do that. You're over-engineering it. So when Fermi's there at startup, Fermi and Leona Woods Libby are there, and they load the thing up, and they pull out the control rods, and the reactor starts up. Well, it starts up and everybody's cheering, and then a couple hours later, it starts powering down. So they pull out all the rods, and the whole thing just shuts down. And they later discover that they had a buildup of xenon poisoning. Xenon, being a neutron absorber, basically shut the reaction down. By this point, they had spent millions and millions of dollars. And not just on one reactor, but they were building 2 more. They built 3. B kind of gets all of the glory, but it's the one that's been preserved. But there was B and D and F. What they ended up doing, and they ended up running calculations, and the engineers said, well, they had to overcome the xenon with a flood of neutrons. And so that's when they filled in those other tubes. And they fueled the other tubes, they pulled out the control rods, and there was enough to get over that initial xenon poisoning to get to a sustained chain reaction. If it hadn't been for that addition of the extra 500 tubes, and part of that was just DuPont's focus on over-engineering and just, over-engineering, like covering your bases, the B-reactor would have gone down as one of the most expensive failures, or at least had been significantly delayed. If they had built it with the initial specs and realized what they had done wrong and had to add 500 more tubes, they would have had to take the pile apart. And that would have been really dangerous and really costly, or just build a whole new one and delay the process again. And that would have meant delaying the first shipment of plutonium by months, probably. That would have changed world history.
It would have, yeah, absolutely.
In a big way. So the other story is that when Ben Johnson and I were doing research for our manuscript, Making the Impossible Possible, the story of DuPont and their unique capabilities in the Manhattan Project, we discovered that some of the initial physicists at the University of Chicago had actually tried to influence site selection by saying that they could place the reactor near any river, that Groves was being too picky. They suggested placing the first production reactor at the mouth of the Potomac.
Oh.
Which, one, does not really have the water flow that one needs,
No.
but two, really underestimating the potential danger and contamination, because when talking about Hanford, we have to talk about and acknowledge the fact that Hanford released massive amounts of radiation into the water, or in terms of discharge, especially in the beginning when they were just figuring out how long do we let the fuel cool? How long do we let the water cool before we pump it back into the river? And just the temperature of the water alone changed the Columbia, altering fish populations, having all these drastic effects. When Hanford was running in full, the average temperature of the Columbia River went up by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Which is a pretty significant change. I mean, that's a lot of warm water.
Wow. That changes the ecosystem of the whole river.
If it does very much. And of course, there are byproducts that are going in there. And a lot of the nasty stuff that was going in there was all sorts of chemicals that had been used to combat corrosion, all sorts of hexafluorides that they'd used to combat corrosion in the process tubes and other things. And that's just the cooling water from the reactors. We haven't even touched the releases from the processing facilities like T-Plant, which were, before they put HEPA filters on those plants, they were releasing really high amounts of curies, like totally unacceptable levels in any time. But again, learning about how long to let fuel cool, what kind of filters one needs, when to process. If you had built a reactor at the mouth of the Potomac, you would have had to put the production facility pretty near there. That story to me is kind of funny because it seems a little absurd, but that also, I think what it does more than that is it illustrates the disconnect between the physicist and the engineer, and really how much more control the engineers had over Hanford, and why it's this. In our first conversation we had, we talked about how Los Alamos and Oak Ridge are a bit better known, and they're also kind of a bit sexier. They have this big story, especially Los Alamos, where there's all the physicists are up in this mesa, in this camp. It's this lab, this perfect beaker of innovation, and they're all learning from each other, and it's all these big personalities. Hanford is this big engineering story in the middle of the desert that is super secret, and its job is to do its thing and have nobody notice what's going on. And it did that really well, but it's also, no one's writing exciting plays or books or movies about the triumph of the engineer.
No, it's poor engineers.
Well, they get paid well, so looking at them as a historian, I'm like, you guys get pretty well compensated.
And you're right, because Los Alamos, how many documentaries start with Nobel Prize winners and those who have yet to win their prize convene in Los Alamos? They lead you to believe that every scientist that ever touched Los Alamos won a Nobel Prize.
Yeah. There's all these big figures, and a lot of these people, even their mundane stuff or their observations of these things become canon in atomic history, right? Like Oppenheimer's famous quote when he saw Trinity from is it the Bhagavad Gita, right? This kind of,
yeah.
And a lot of these people went on to lead national laboratories, or some of them went on to win Nobel Prizes, whereas Hanford just grew. It just did its thing, and it did it bigger and better as years went on.
And the thing is I can't name one person from Hanford at all,
right.
Honestly. Yeah. And thinking back, the only time that I know of Hanford is when some physicist went there.
Yeah.
Leona Wood goes, Fermi goes. Whenever Hanford intersects a story of a physicist, it shows up. But if not, it's just in the background doing its thing and completely forgotten about.
Yeah. And I think part of that is, in one small way, it's kind of victim of its own success. It did it well. No one talked about it. It worked. It didn't cause any problems. And it really offered extremely, even if you worked for DuPont in patrol, or you were a clerk, or you were in the kitchen, you lived in Richland. The government owned the homes in Richland. You paid rent to the government, but they built all these nice new shiny homes. You had literally this perfect nuclear family in your nuclear town, working your nuclear job. Everyone's being taken care of. Everyone's being paid extremely well. And everyone's just going with the flow. And a lot of that depends on Hanford not getting a lot of attention, a lot of questions not being asked. And there's a lot of echoes of that today in terms of how people here feel about what they did or what their family did, how critics of Hanford kind of attack the silence and the complicity, and there is silence and complicity, and how contested the history is and how it's very divergent between people that are local versus outside perspectives. But Hanford, like I said, it just did its thing and it did it well, but it did its thing really, really well. I mean, by 1954, there are 8 reactors up and running, but just pumping stuff out.
That I didn't even know. It's B-Reactor. And then all the physicists leave and nothing happens until polonium just shows up from this black box.
Yes, plutonium. So they build B and D and F, and everybody always asks, where's A reactor? Well, A was really close to an electrical substation in an area. DuPont had marked out different areas. They decided not to build A because it was close to a state highway, but it was also, there was an electrical substation that was there called the Midway Substation, and it's midway between Grand Coulee and Bonneville, which is why it's the Midway Substation. And that was another reason. Why is Hanford here? We had more electricity than we knew what to do with in World War II because of Grand Coulee and Bonneville. We had these massive engineering projects that had really primed the Pacific Northwest for major industries like Boeing to come in, but also like Hanford. We have the Columbia River, ice-free, cool water, pretty clean.
It was pretty clean.
Yeah, well, yeah, fast flowing then before all the dams. And that's why there's no dam in the 52 miles of the Hanford Reach, because Hanford needed that water to flow fast enough to carry all the stuff away. We need it to disperse, but it's a big river. Columbia is a huge, huge river. But the electricity was another major feature. So they skipped A, they went to B, and they said, we want to give more space in case this thing doesn't work.
I just want to step in here for a moment and clarify. When he says doesn't work, he means blows up. They needed to give the reactor more space because they realized they might blow up.
So we'll go to D, and then we'll go to F. They end up building a replacement reactor for D because D initially doesn't work because the graphite starts to move too much. They end up figuring out what's causing that. They build C. They build C right next to B, realizing they can share all of the utilities of like the water treatment plant, the water pumping plant, the power plant, all that stuff. And they also build H, and then they build K East and K West, which are called the jumbo reactors. And the jumbo reactors are almost over 2,000 megawatts in terms of their heat, their power output. Huge, huge reactors. And so by the mid-50s, all these things are just churning. They're just 24/7.
I've never had an interest to visit Hanford. I mean, if I'm in the area, I'll go. But after talking to you, I really want to come out and visit Hanford. It sounds like something I have to see now because you've made me excited about it.
Oh, thank you. The look on people's faces when we lead them in, the B-Reactor is cool because it's just this old, it's really preserved in its kind of like mid-50s way. They're trying to roll it back to how it would have looked in the Manhattan Project. But, it was used up until 1968 and then abandoned and just placed in standby mode. So it's very well preserved. But when people round the corner and they see the front face and you see the 2004 tubes and all of the piping and all the pigtails that feed the helium in there, and you're just like, holy cow, it's a monument to the nuclear age. And I think it's the most salient one because Oak Ridge is mostly gone.
Oak Ridge still has their test reactor.
They do.
That the B-Reactor is modeled off of, but it's behind the fence. So unless you have a reason to be inside Oak Ridge and someone takes you there, you can't see it. So I think Hanford's the only publicly available facility.
Yeah, and that's part of the interesting irony, too, is that for how secret we are and how much use Hanford got. That also meant that by the 90s, most of Hanford was still there. And also there was a big push locally to preserve Hanford and to really tell Hanford's story and to place it. And when the Park Service was approached about the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, the most convincing was to include Hanford as one of the units. And I think once they talked to people from the Smithsonian and the Park Service, it got them out to Hanford and showed them and really explained. I think they were like you. They went from not thinking about Hanford at all to being like, okay, I get it. This is clearly an important place. And part of it was like, well, how do you tell the story if not for the workhorse? And like any workhorse, it did its job, and it did its job relatively well and quietly. But it's filled, though, with all of these interesting small stories, but also it's also the nexus for a lot of these real large issues around proliferation and mutually assured destruction, and it's intricately tied to our nuclear world.
Yes.
So when people do come, when things open up again and you can take tours, you can tour the B-Reactor. We have several pre-Manhattan Project facilities left. You can take a separate pre-Manhattan Project tour as well. It's kind of like the Ghost Town tour. I do a lot of those, but it's good. That tour is really great because in the B-Reactor tour, you just go to the reactor and back. The pre-Manhattan tour, you actually get to go through the whole site, and we don't stop at any of the other reactors, but you get a really good sense of how big the site is, and we go along the river, so you get to see the shells of all of these buildings. A lot of them have been remediated down to just the core, which is then covered up, and then it's interim safe storage, or we call it cocooning, colloquially. They basically cocoon them for 75 years to let the reactor cool down. There's two other things I want to mention about B-Reactor before we kind of move on. One is that they initially designed it to be 250 megawatts. Part of the big push after World War II, which in 250 megawatts is hot. The X-10 is like a fraction of that.
Yep.
X-10 would not have been a production reactor, but it was a really good proof of concept reactor. After the war, DuPont's there until the end of the Manhattan Project, which when the AEC takes over in early 1947, switches over to GE. But DuPont and GE are tasked with make it more efficient. And so they bring in a lot of new promising young engineers and physicists to how do we increase the power? And this is a really testament to the original design. So they start to look at ways to change up the latticing or what fuel they put where. They start to look at ways to get more water into the reactor. And they start to look at ways if they're going to put in more fuel and get it hotter, how do we do better cooling? So they do a helium system that really sucks off a lot of heat. The B-Reactor goes from being originally a 250 megawatt reactor to, by the mid-60s, when it's at its peak operating efficiency, operating at almost 1,800 megawatts. Whoa. That's almost 9 times. It's like 8.6 times. I did the math once. I might be a little fuzzy, but it's almost 9 times. That's like saying, I'm going to build an engine. I'm going to build a 100 horsepower engine. And by tinkering with it over 20 years, I could get it to be almost 900 horsepower. With the same block, same valves, same with that reactor, the same process tubes, the same graphite lattice. Just, that's a testament to how resilient that design was. By the end of its time, water would take just over a second to go in the front to the back of the reactor to cool. Water went into the reactor at 38 degrees, just above freezing. It exited the reactor about 10 degrees shy of boiling.
Oh my.
That's how hot and how powerful that thing is operating. It's amazing.
I have, again, a newfound respect for Hanford and the engineers. If you look at someplace like Windscale, which was the reactor that was made in Britain, they also tinkered with their block, and they landed up with a very different set of circumstances.
Yes, they did.
For the Hanford engineers to be able to tinker with it for 20 years and get so much more power out of it is just amazing.
It is. It's a testament to that hard-nosed, purposeful engineering. And that's where a lot of the Hanford research and development is. Hanford gets this reputation as not really contributing to the literature, not being a place of scientific discovery. And that's not necessarily true, but all of Hanford's research and development is about how do we do this bigger and better and faster, and sometimes safer.
Well, it's engineering, research, and development.
It is. And safer for workers generally, but also for the environment. People were, by the late 40s, people were really concerned about releases, even before that, but they were really starting to take steps to mitigate releases because they did not want to damage the surrounding environment. But then again, the waste is a totally different issue. They knew they'd deal with it someday. They did want to keep it safe until they dealt with it, but that solution is a little different. But in terms of operating the reactors, there's just volumes of environmental monitoring. There's volumes of research on all different alloys and all different kinds of little tiny experiments, different chemicals used in processing. The research is enough to fill a major library of just all of these reports and technical documents and all sorts of test research on fuel cladding. We had a test reactor, a recycling reactor here at Hanford. There's lots. And when you talk to people that worked out there, they worked these very specific compartmentalized jobs in a lot of cases. It was very, almost like Taylorism, if you're familiar with that concept of Taylor was brought in to help automate American manufacturing in the early 20th century. A lot of his ideas were pretty bunk. He ended up making workers' lives a lot worse. But one of his things was compartmentalization, right? And just like training someone to do a specific task over and over again. A lot of the people brought in, people I know, I'm on boards with, or friends of mine, were brought in to say, like, I'm a graphite scientist. They study graphite and study the way that changes. Like my friend John Fox, who's the former head of the B-Reactor Museum Association, he was brought in to do graphite work as a tech grad by GE in the 1950s and ended up just mostly studying, moved on to some other projects, worked at the plutonium recycle test reactor, but again, just very directed scientific engineering discovery. But there were some scientists and there was a lot of research being put out, but it was focused on Hanford.
And there's some engineer out there that's just screaming at us about how important all that work was, and we just don't get it.
Well, it's important in the way that 18,000 nuclear weapons are a force to be reckoned with, and the environment and the waste is an important problem. The weapons are an important problem. Yeah, it's super important.
I want to go back to, you mentioned that Hanford is now part of the National Park Service.
Yes.
When did that happen?
Well, the origins of that effort really go back to the late 90s and really go back to 1990, 1991. So the short answer is Hanford became the Manhattan Project National Historical Park was signed into law in November of 2015. But the seeds of it go back really at the end of the Cold War. Here at Hanford, the B-Reactor Museum Association, which I am the president of this year for the past couple of years, was formed in late 1990, early 1991, when I was like 10 years old. And that was a group of mostly retired Hanford engineers and workers who wanted to preserve the legacy of the B-Reactor, but also some other people, some folks that were just kind of into local history and kind of the history of the area, but a lot of retired Hanford workers. And in fact, our membership is still mostly retired Hanford workers. We call it BRMA, or Burma for short, was formed. And their goal initially, they wanted to turn the B-Reactor into a museum, which is a real David versus Goliath story in historical preservation. Historical preservationists lose more battles than they win. We're really lucky when we can save historic buildings or historic structures or sites, because that requires money. It requires political will, but it's more effort to save than it is just to tear it down.
Yeah, absolutely.
So initially they tried to make a documentary about the B-Reactor to get some more information out there, and they did a bunch of oral histories, including oral histories, and this was back in the mid-90s with people, some of them worked startup at B-Reactor, were there with Fermi and with these other people who were involved. One of the guys they interviewed was responsible for the rail logistics and like getting supplies in to Hanford and to build, and had to constantly deal with people asking him what they were importing all these weird things for. And that reminds me, I have a story about B-Reactor. I won't tell it right now, but it'll go back into one of these really interesting stories about B-Reactor. But remind me.
Okay. Can I ask, though, what is the weirdest thing that he had to justify bringing in?
Okay, well then I guess I'll just tell you now.
Okay.
This is the weird story. So one very important piece of equipment when you are cleaning process tubes or working with water and radioactivity in a nuclear reactor is the humble Kotex pad.
Wait, really?
They're absorbent. So out of the B-reactor, in the medical cabinet, there are boxes and boxes and boxes of 50s era. There's no more Manhattan Project ones because they use them all, but 50s era Kotex pads. These are big pads. These are like the size of a chalkboard eraser. They're large compared to what you see in shelves today. And these are really big, but they're really absorbent. And anyone who's worked at Hanford or a reactor like Hanford, or who is a rad tech or a health physics technician, will tell you that they use Kotex. Not now, but up through like the 80s and 90s. And so the weirdest thing that's out at the reactor is this giant supply cabinet full of Kotex. And when I show it to people, I ask them what they think it's for. And they say, oh, well, it's clearly for women that had to go and change there. I'm like, besides Leona Woods Libby, there were no female reactor operators
Right.
out at Hanford for decades.
And that supply would have lasted her and her grandchildren their whole entire life.
You wouldn't need them in that quantities unless you had an army of women.
Which we can safely say in physics, there was never an army of women doing anything.
Yeah. Look, in engineering physics, there's not an army of women, okay? There were not that many women out on site. And it really wasn't until the 80s, 70s, and 80s when there were pushes to desegregate jobs, but also pushes for gender equity that women began to get hired into jobs like decommissioning and deconstruction. In fact, I interviewed a lady who was the first woman hired to do D&D work out of the B-reactor, like cleaning the place up, doing abatement work for asbestos and other things. And she described a really rough and tumble boys club, which she grew up on a farm with a bunch of boys and liked that, and that was kind of her jam. But yeah, not an army of women. So anyway, the Kotex pad. So I'll ask people and they'll be like, oh, for women. I'm like, no, it's to clean up spills. And this guy, Jack Ryan, he was in charge of procurement for the 100 areas, the reactor areas. And he told the story about hearing some of his guys unloading these trains, whispering like, what in the world are we making out here that we need this many Kotex pads, because where's all the women? But they just became industry standard. And so it's one of those things that's feminine hygiene products are tied into the nuclear age.
I've never heard that story. And I also imagine all the conspiracy theories that these guys are coming up with as they're unloading these trains, wondering, where are all the women? Where are they hiding them?
That's the one story, the Kotex. And they're really funny, too, because they are 50s, 60s era Kotex. It's beautiful, like, faux embroidery with, like, a flower on it. And it's such a great visual aid. Yeah, it's one of my favorite human stories of the B-reactor.
It's also a story of ingenuity, again, with the Manhattan Project, that instead of developing something new, they're like, well, this product works and we can get it, so let's use it.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about what they were doing at Hanford, which is creating an industry for the processing of plutonium. Basically, it's the birth of the nuclear reactor industry.
You've mentioned this processing plant a couple times, and I've asked a lot about the B-reactor, but what happens once the plutonium is, quote, ready from the B-reactor? Then it gets knocked out of the B-reactor, and then it's not done yet. So what happens?
So it cools for a certain period of time. There's a big pool of water on the back of the reactor, and that's about 20, 25 feet deep. The elements go down there. They cool. Initially, they cooled it only for 30 days or 40 days. They later extended that to 60 to 90 because they realized that it was too green when they were processing it, and it was so hot. The stat gases were so intense that they, again, learned over time. And that's really where the bulk of Hanford's really bad releases are during World War II and immediately after, when they were figuring this stuff out. But sorry, to go back. So they let it cool, and then they use tongs. Like, you know those grabbers that you can get at the store that like help old people pick up stuff or kids play with them? They basically use 20-foot long versions of those. They stack the elements in these cages very carefully. They have beautiful diagrams on how it's supposed to look that hang up in the B-reactor. Then they winch those up. They put it in a lead-lined cask car on a train. The cask car is separated by like a couple empty lengths from the locomotive itself. Again, how do we protect against radiation? Time, distance, shielding. So that's your distance and shielding and the time. All three of those principles come in there. That's taken up to the T plant. And the T plant and the other plants like it are basically these long concrete canyons laid out on the desert. They're about 800 feet long and about 80 feet high with a stack on the end. They're huge. These would be 80-story buildings if you stood it up.
Or 8 football fields.
Yeah, they're huge. They were called Queen Marys because they were about the size of the Queen Mary ocean liner, just laid out in the middle of the high desert. And that is on the plateau, several hundred feet above groundwater, up away from the reactors, about 7 miles away from the reactors. Again, the thinking is, look, if something goes wrong in one place, it's not going to jeopardize what's happening in another place, at least not immediately. You don't want to put the processing plant right next to the reactor, even though that would save you transfer time. You don't want an explosion in the reactor that knocks out a wall in the T plant and lets all of that stuff go. The T plant was basically, and I'm going to really simplify it, but basically the hot fuel was unloaded and then it would undergo a series of steps that was designed to dissolve the aluminum cladding, and through a series of agitators, centrifuges, chemical catalyst treatments where they would be using these catalyst chemicals in really large quantities, so large that they had these like 1,000-pound scales that they would measure this stuff out of. We have a couple in the collection. They're really beautiful. They would separate out plutonium through a series of engineering processes. Basically, it's a giant laboratory, but it's unique. And like the B-Reactor, it's over-engineered. This process is such an integral part of the process. If Hanford is like the unsexiest part, we've now talked about how important Hanford is, how interesting it is. The B-Reactor is definitely the sexiest part. The processing, this is such a crucial step, but the B-Reactor is the charismatic thing, you see.
Oh, wow.
You can't actually even go to the T plant. It's still in use today, actually. They're storing sludge in it from the K reactors. That's a whole nother long story. A court order stopped Hanford from processing fuel in the late 80s, so they let it sit in a pool of water 20 feet deep. Some of it eventually leaked and formed sludge, and they were trying to remediate the K reactor, so they had to find a place to put the sludge. Well, what better than to use a building that has so much concrete shielding in it that it can be saved? And sorry, and I should go back. 20 feet of water, that's a shielding thing. The water is the cool, but they worked out that around 20, 25 feet of water would shield a person from that incredibly radioactive fuel down there. If they were wearing protective clothing, that would stop enough of that radioactivity. And that radioactive fuel also glowed that beautiful blue, that Chernikov radiation. The T plant is thicker at the bottom. Its walls at the bottom, the concrete is 6 feet thick.
That's thick. That is very thick.
That's really thick. But it tapers off as it goes on. The entire process is done remotely.
Oh.
Human beings cannot be in the T plant exposed to these processes. So it's a series of cells, and each cell is one step in the process, and there's over 40 of them in this 800-foot-long building. Each one has equipment in it. They're all connected to one another somehow, and they all have giant concrete coffin lids that go over them when they're in operation. The coffin lids are removed, and work is done on them if a piece of equipment needs to be installed or repaired by a crane. So there's an operator here, but the operator can't have a direct view into the canyon because that would expose them to radiation. To shield them, the leaded glass would need to be so thick they wouldn't be able to see what they're doing. So how do they do it? Well, this crane operator does all of this work with a periscope, and I haven't been able to prove this, but we think this is true. The first industrial use of television in an industrial process. 1944. But the old school crane operator said that the TV and the screen was tiny. The TV was so crummy that they preferred the periscope instead. And remember, that periscope, because it's not a direct view, is going to shield you from that radiation. It's also why if you ever go in the B-Reactor, all of the hallways, there aren't long, straight hallways. There's a few that have been made, but it's an alteration of the original design because the more corners and things you put in, the more any radioactivity would have to bounce around, and so you'd be able to contain, say, a spill. So the T plant is amazing because it's operated remotely, but Groves and Mathias and the engineers said, if we're going to operate this remotely, these crane guys are going to have to be able to use a wrench with a crane, and they would have all these special adapters that they would be able to use, like an impact wrench, like on a crane. They said if they're going to operate it remotely, we should build it remotely.
Wait, what?
We're not going to bring people into the cell and install it. We're going to use the crane to drop the equipment in, and then the crane operator is going to screw it into place. So after they put in the concrete and they put in the sections, they drilled holes or did the connecting bits, all of the equipment was installed with the crane by a guy looking through a periscope.
Okay, the only thing I can think of is when they were recruiting for astronauts, why were these guys not the first ones on the list?
Because they were already working at Hanford. It's amazing when you think of the skill to operate such a large machine. If Hanford already is the unsung part of the Manhattan Project, this is like layers of unsung down deep. And this is the part that really fascinates me.
That's amazing.
Chemical engineers would have to take samples of this material to figure out, is the chemistry going according to plan? And if it's not, do we have to add in more catalyst? Do we have to send this to the agitator again? Do we have to heat it up some more? And so they would have these points inserted where they could go take a sample, immediately stick it in a lead-lined cask and take it to an analytical laboratory. Where early on it was much more hard chemistry. Later on, some of the first use of the mass spectrometer. And the end result, after these 40-something steps, would be plutonium nitrate, this kind of liquidy paste thing. And that was what was initially sent out to Los Alamos. We actually have one of these plutonium cask canisters in our collection. It actually looks like a bulb, like you would plant, and they would pour it down there, and it was wider at the bottom so that it would spread out more, so that it wouldn't get super concentrated and accidentally go critical. They had to design this thing to carry this paste. Later on in the early Cold War, they developed PFP, or the plutonium finishing plant, which turns the final product into what we colloquially call pucks, although people that work out there hate that term. But it turns it into these discs of plutonium metal, which was much, much safer to store and move than the liquid.
Why do the people who work out there hate it being called pucks?
I think they think it trivializes it. Because you think of a hockey puck, and that's what it looks like. If you're wondering a visual, what does this thing look like? It's a dull, kind of grayish, metallic puck. And it's really warm to the touch, but you could hold it with a gloved hand because it's an alpha emitter, minimal amount of shielding needed, but it's also the fuel for some of the most destructive things that have ever been made. It's really weirdly innocuous when you look at this product.
So all of these processes that you've explained, and you've just explained it for one plant, and I'm sure there's more than one processing plant, there's more than one finishing plant. Okay, well, there's not just one. It might be one-to-one, but there's not one finishing plant. There's not one processing plant. There's multiples of these all over the site.
So here's the thing. They built the 3 reactors, and they thought, we're going to need 3 plants. 1 plant, 1 reactor. Well, it turned out that actually the T plant could process a lot more than they thought. So they built T, B, and U. And I'm actually not sure as to why it's T, B, and U, but those are the letters. So when they finish T, and B and D and F reactors are sending their product, their fuel, irradiated fuel, they're realizing, hey, we can pretty much do this all at T. But they'd already built B and U. So they start thinking of other uses for them, and they eventually do have other uses. Originally, they use a process, and if there's any chemical engineers listening, this will be something that they might think is interesting. They use this bismuth phosphate process as the main catalyst to extract the plutonium. And I believe that that's because that's what Seaborg had used, or they had developed in the laboratory. It wasn't really that suitable, though, for large scales. And so by 1946, they're trying to get out of bismuth phosphate. And Steve Buckingham, a gentleman that worked at Hanford, still alive, he's 97. Hi, Steve, if you're listening to this. He was brought in 1946, 47 to help them transition away from bismuth phosphate. And that's really where a lot of my information comes from this. And he worked out at T for decades out in the 200 area. And I should say the reactors are known as the 100 area. The processing is the 200 area. And all of the research, development, and fuel fab is the 300 area. So if I ever slip into that, that's where we're at. So the 200 area is where the processing is, and also where all the waste is stored, the waste tanks. So they move away from bismuth phosphate because initially they're just looking at plutonium. And as Rhodes mentioned, plutonium is just like a fraction of a percent of what's in here. So you have this massive amount of waste, a lot of which is uranium, which could be gathered, separated out, and re-enriched. And as we know, the world does not have an infinite supply of uranium. And sourcing it was difficult. And so we got to get more of this. So eventually they develop a different way that can create a final product that is easier to separate out the plutonium. And we start to get into different types of processing. So T is still used for a while, but they get more efficient processes. In the late 40s, early 50s, they build the redox plant, REDOX, that's short for reduction oxidization. Another process, a bit more efficient. The redox facility looks just the same, though. It's just a long, 800-foot long labyrinth, canyon, coffin type thing that goes from one end to the other. It's still pretty basic, albeit terrifying and kind of cool. And then they get to PureX, which is the plutonium-uranium extraction process. We talk about the plutonium that was made, the vast majority of it, the Cold War, the weapons, goes through the PureX process, and that's what's exported to Savannah River. They do a variation of that process. That becomes the standard for plutonium processing, and that captures the uranium a lot better. So they can be reintroducing the uranium into the cycle and basically just being more efficient. Because in World War II, they're sped up, but it's really wasteful. It's really, really wasteful. One of the things that they use B and U for is they have to go back to the waste tanks. This horrible witch's brew, not only of radionuclides, but all the chemicals. I mean, you got chemicals in there that dissolve uranium. You got chemicals in there that separate all sorts of these things away from each other. They got to go back to that waste, pump it out of tanks, and rerun it through a process that just separates the uranium, and then pump that stuff back into tanks. And they do this over the course of several times. And then at one point they realize, oh, the tanks are too concentrated. We got to pump some out of this tank, pump it into another tank. But the problem is with all these different chemical processes over time, it's all these different chemical catalysts. Some might react with others in a way. As these things half-life, they fission off into different products. What if something fissions off into an element that reacts with the waste tank problem becomes this crazy evolving problem. It looks like, if you open a geology textbook and you look at a strata of the earth and you see all these different layers of things, that's kind of what a waste tank looks like. There's stuff that's like sand. There's stuff that's like jello. There's stuff that is solid. There's stuff that's liquid. There's stuff that's all sorts of different textures and compositions. And it's all hanging out. And each tank is slightly different. So when we have this 56 million gallons of waste spread out through 170 tanks, and people say, well, why haven't you pumped all that up and processed it yet?
You can't.
Well, part of the reason, it's really hard. You need a plant that handles all of these different variables, which is what they've been trying to build out here since the late 90s. You need a plant that handles all that safely and can adjust. And because it's the legacy of doing a whole bunch of things that no one had ever done before without really any thought as to what the end game was or how to clean it all up. And so just like building these reactors on an industrial scale Hanford was the first time that had been done. That was groundbreaking. Treating Hanford's waste is also groundbreaking. It requires the same level of achievement and effort that the Manhattan Project did times 100. And it certainly costs times 100. We spend $2 billion a year. Manhattan Project costs $2 billion. You look at the money difference, but every year at Hanford, I did the math one time. So Hanford made up 24% of the Manhattan Project's budget.
Okay.
It was about $200 million, $224 million. We spend $2 billion a year at Hanford cleaning up waste. Every year, we spend the equivalent of 22.4 Hanfords.
But this goes back to during the war, we weren't concerned about anything except winning the war. We weren't concerned about any of the consequences. And, it's kicking that can.
No.
And it's a really big, toxic can that Hanford has kicked.
It is. And a lot of these engineers and scientists knew that. And they said, this is going to be a real evolving problem someday. But they also all said, this is a problem down the line.
Yep.
It's a problem. We can manage it for now. Let's manage it for now. And the long-term consequence of that is a giant problem down the line that we are all, and our children and our children's children, are all forced to deal with. And it's also, though, there's been all of these attempts to move waste around and do different things and extract things, has just created a mess out of a mess. It's a result of trying all this stuff for the first time.
And is this one of the reasons why the site is given the title the most toxic place in America?
Oh, yeah. And it's also a big reason why other nuclear sites like West Valley and Savannah River are so much farther along in their cleanup and their waste vitrification, the glassification of this waste. Because, for example, Savannah River had one process. There were some alterations to it, but bismuth phosphate and redox and Purex are really different processes. And so you have all these different things that go into it. Whereas like West Valley, Savannah River, and a few others are much farther along in their cleanup mission because Hanford, one, just by volume, has the most.
Right.
And then two, by it being the laboratory for all of this, we're also stuck with the legacy of all of that pioneering, which is a lot of mistakes. Some mistakes were made.
Thank you for listening. I had a really great afternoon speaking with Robert, and I would like to thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to record with me. I would also like to thank Lexi Weghorn for all of her help with this podcast. But it's not over. Check your feed. The second part of the conversation should already be there. I won't make you wait like I did with the Richard Rhodes episodes. But remember, I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.